In the vast, sprawling cathedral of country music, there are pews reserved for saints and legends. There are polished marble statues for the kings and queens who wore rhinestone crowns and sold out stadiums. Their hymns are woven into the American fabric, sung from the Grand Ole Opry to the family minivan, tales of gentle love, stoic pride, and down-home wisdom. But every cathedral has its crypts, its shadowed corners where the ghosts reside. These are the spirits who tell a different story, a truth that's a little too raw, a little too real for the bright stage lights. Their voices don't soothe, they haunt. They cry out from the scratched vinyl of a forgotten jukebox in a roadside tavern, their pain and ecstasy forever circling at 45 revolutions per minute. And perhaps no ghost in that hallowed hall wails with a more profound, more beautifully tragic echo than that of Gary Stewart. His was not merely a voice, it was a physical event, a seismic tremor that registered the precise location of a breaking heart. It was a sound that didn't just sing about the party. To realize his vision, he brought in a new wave of creative energy. He famously collaborated with Southern rock royalty, guitar virtuoso Dickey Betts of the Allman Brothers Band, to inject a hard-edged rock sound into his music. The sessions were a vibrant cross-genre experiment, moving beyond his trusted road band to create a new sonic palette. Was the party itself wild, ecstatic, and teetering on the verge of collapse? His signature vibrato wasn't a trained technique but an uncontrollable sob, a man's entire nervous system vibrating with an excess of feeling, be it joy, lust, or bottomless despair. They crowned him the King of the Honky Tonks, a title he didn't just accept but embodied. He didn't just sing the songs of late-night sin and morning after regret. He mainlined them, living a life so intertwined with his art that it became impossible to see where the man ended and the music began. This is the story of that man, a musical firebrand whose searing flame illuminated the darkest corners of country music, and whose life became the ultimate cautionary tale, a testament to the fact that some fires, once lit, burn with such intensity that they inevitably consume themselves, leaving behind only smoke memory and a devastating final silence. To truly understand the sound Gary Stewart made, you must first travel to the place that made him, the black-dusted, hard-bitten heart of Appalachian coal country. He was born in 1944 in Jenkins, Kentucky, a town not built on dreams, but on a geological seam of bituminous coal. Life in Letcher County was dictated by the deep, rhythmic breathing of the mines, the morning whistle, the rumble of machinery from beneath the earth, the weary sigh of men emerging at dusk, their faces permanently masked with soot. This was not the idyllic, romanticized south of bluegrass meadows and front porch swings. This was a land of stark, rugged beauty and even starker economic reality. It was a place of deep-rooted family ties and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders, a culture of fierce pride and an ever-present grinding fatalism. Gary's father, George Stewart, was a coal miner, a man who spent his days chipping away at the darkness to provide for his family. But by night, he was a musician, a fiddler, who could coax melodies of both celebration and sorrow from his instrument. The Stewart home was a sanctuary of sound, an escape from the harshness of the world outside. The radio was a constant companion, piping in the foundational voices of country music, the mournful yodel of Jimmie Rodgers, the stark poetry of Hank Williams, the barroom philosophy of Ernest Tubb. For young Gary, these weren't just songs. They were lessons in emotional truth. He learned almost by osmosis that country music was the vernacular of the working man's soul, a language built to carry the weight of hardship, heartache, and the fleeting, desperate pursuit of a good time. He was a musical prodigy, absorbing it all with an innate understanding that defied his years. He picked up the guitar and piano not through formal lessons, but through observation and instinct, his fingers finding the right chords as if by memory. While other boys were playing baseball, Gary was dissecting the intricate boogie-woogie piano riffs of Moon Mullican and the hard-driving guitar of Chuck Berry. He was a sponge, soaking up not just country, but the raw, electrifying energy of early rock and roll and the deep, soulful ache of the blues. In the cultural crucible of the mountains, these sounds weren't segregated. They were all just branches of the same tree, a music of raw, unfiltered human expression. When Gary was a teenager, the Stewart family, like so many others, joined the Appalachian diaspora, leaving the exhausted coal fields for the promise of a better life under the bright, hopeful sun of Fort Pierce, Florida. It was a culture shock, a transition from the shadowed hollers to the flat, sprawling Sunshine State. But the music came with him. It was in Fort Pierce that his raw talent began to coalesce into a distinct style. He formed his first bands, playing in the local bars and VFW halls, the kind of places where the chicken wire in front of the stage was less a decoration and more a piece of necessary safety equipment. These were his proving grounds, the smoky, beer-soaked rooms where he learned how to command an audience, how to make them dance, and how to make them cry. He wasn't just singing the songs, he was putting on a show, channeling the manic, untamed energy of his rock and roll heroes, like Jerry Lee Lewis. He'd hammer the piano keys with his fists, his elbows, even his feet, his long hair flying as he worked himself into a sweat-drenched frenzy. It was in these rough-and-tumble bars that he met Mary Lou Taylor, a local girl who saw through the wild stage persona to the shy, sensitive young man beneath. Their connection was immediate and profound. She became his anchor, his confidant, and the unwavering center of his universe. They married young and soon became parents. With a family to support, the dream of a music career suddenly felt less like a youthful fantasy and more like an urgent, necessary ambition. The next logical step was Nashville. In the late 1960s, Gary and his young family made the pilgrimage to Music City, the mecca of country music. But the Nashville they found was not the city of Hank Williams. It was a city in the midst of an identity crisis. The dominant sound was countrypolitan, a polished, sophisticated style designed to cross over to pop audiences. Producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley had smoothed out country's rough edges, replacing the mournful fiddle and steel guitar with lush string sections, orchestral arrangements, and smooth, crooning vocals. It was the era of Eddie Arnold and Jim Reeves, a sound that was elegant, respectable, and about as far removed from the gritty reality of a Kentucky coal camp or a Florida honky tonk as one could possibly get. Gary Stewart's raw, rock and roll infused sound was anathema to this polished aesthetic. He was too loud, too intense, too real. He spent his days working odd jobs and his nights knocking on doors on Music Row, his demo tapes almost universally rejected by executives who couldn't see past his untamed energy. But his talent was too immense to be ignored completely. He found a crucial ally in Honky Tonks star Stonewall Jackson, who recognized the young man's prodigious gift for melody and lyrics. Jackson took Gary under his wing, giving him a spot in his touring band and, more importantly, a foot in the door as a songwriter. For several years, Gary made his living in the shadows, penning songs for other artists. He co-wrote Billy Walker's top 5 hit She Goes Walking Through My Mind and found success with songs recorded by Cal Smith and Nat Stuckey. His compositions were clever and well-crafted, but they were still constrained by the Nashville formula. He was writing songs for other voices, taming his own wild musical instincts to fit the commercial demands of the day. He did manage to secure a recording contract with Cap Records, but the experience was a frustrating exercise in creative suppression. The label tried to mold him into a conventional country-politan singer, drowning his voice in strings and saccharine backup vocals. The resulting records were commercial and artistic failures, sounding like a caged animal trying to sing a lullaby. Discouraged and broke, Gary gave up. He packed up his family and left Nashville, turning his back on the city that had chewed him up and spit him out. He returned to Florida, to the familiar comfort of Mary Lou and the smoky bars where his music was understood and appreciated, if not celebrated on a national scale. He resigned himself to a life as a local legend, a brilliant talent destined to burn out in obscurity. The dream, it seemed, was over, but a single, forgotten demo tape, passed from hand to hand like a secret, was about to change everything. That tape landed on the desk of Roy Dia, a veteran producer at RCA Records. Dia was a man with a keen ear for authenticity. He had worked with the likes of Waylon Jennings, helping to craft the rebellious outlaw sound that was beginning to challenge Nashville's slick status quo. As he listened to Gary's demo, he heard what everyone else had missed. He heard the blues, the rock and roll, the raw, unhinged soul. He heard a voice that wasn't just singing about pain, but seemed to be forged from it. He heard a superstar. Dia convinced his bosses at RCA, a label still very much invested in the country-politan sound, to take a massive gamble. He flew to Florida, found Gary playing in a small, run-down bar, and made his pitch. Stewart was skeptical, burned by his past experiences and wary of the Nashville machine. But Dia made him a promise. He promised him complete creative freedom. He told Gary he didn't want to change a thing. He wanted to capture the lightning he had just witnessed on that tiny stage and put it on a record. It was an offer Gary couldn't refuse. The sessions for what would become the album Out of Hand were a revolution in a padded room. Dia surrounded Gary with a band of musicians who understood his rock and roll heart. He encouraged the electric guitarist to play loud, bluesy riffs. He pushed the rhythm section to drive hard to capture the boogie-woogie energy of Gary's live shows. And then he turned Gary loose. He told him to sing it like he felt it, to forget the rules, to let his voice crack and tremble and soar. For the first time in a professional studio, Gary Stewart was allowed to be Gary Stewart. The result was a sonic masterpiece, a landmark album that sounded like a transmission from another planet to the ears of the Nashville establishment. It was country music, but it was also primal rock and roll. It was danceable, but it was also deeply, profoundly, and at the center of it all was that voice, a wild, keening cry that could convey a lifetime of regret in a single quivering note. The album's first single, Drinkin' Thing, was a perfect introduction. Lyrically, it was a classic country cheating song, but sonically, it was a bar fight. It exploded onto the airwaves in 1974 and shot into the top 10. The follow-up, the album's title track, Out of Hand, did the same. But it was the third single that would become his anthem, the song that would define his career and crystallize his persona. She's Actin Single, I'm Drinkin Doubles, was more than just a clever pun. It was a 3-minute psychological drama set to a frantic shuffle. Gary's performance was breathtaking in its raw, unhinged desperation. When he sang the line, "The tavern's been my home away from home," his voice cracked with such genuine anguish that you could practically smell the stale beer and cigarettes. The song was a phenomenon. It climbed all the way to number 1 on the Billboard country charts in the summer of 1975. After years of struggle, rejection, and self-doubt, Gary Stewart, the Kentucky coal miner's son, the Florida bar band singer, was a superstar. The album Out of Hand was certified gold, and he was suddenly one of the most in-demand artists in country music. He was officially crowned the King of the Honky Tonks. The ghost who had been haunting the local bars was now haunting the national airwaves, and the world of country music would never be quite the same. And so, the outcast became the king. The raw, untamable voice from the Florida swamps and Kentucky coalfields had conquered the polished world of Nashville on its own terms. But a crown, especially one forged in the neon glare of 1,000 bar signs, is a heavy thing to wear. For Gary Stewart, the title King of the Honky Tonks was not just a triumphant nickname. It would become a role to play, a cage to escape, and a prophecy to fulfill. The glorious, chaotic, and ultimately tragic reality of his reign was about to begin. The ascent of Gary Stewart to the pinnacle of country music in 1975 was as shocking as it was thrilling. He was the ultimate outsider, a musical insurgent who had stormed the polished gates of Nashville with nothing but a wild mane of hair, a second-hand piano, and a voice that sounded like it had been soaked in whiskey and regret. With the chart-topping success of She's Actin Single, I'm Drinkin Doubles, and the gold-certified album Out of Hand, he was crowned the undisputed King of the Honky Tonks. It was a coronation that celebrated not just his talent, but his authenticity. In an era still dominated by the smooth, orchestral stylings of countrypolitan, Gary was a jolt of raw, high-voltage reality. He was the patron saint of the broken-hearted, the poet laureate of the dive bar, and his kingdom was every dance floor slick with spilled beer from Friday night to closing time. His live shows during this period were the stuff of legend, less like concerts and more like frenetic, cathartic rituals. Backed by his road-tested all-Stewart band, he would hit the stage like a force of nature. He wasn't a static performer content to stand behind a microphone. He was a dervish of denim-clad energy, prowling the stage, sweat flying from his hair as he hammered the piano with the ferocious abandon of Jerry Lee Lewis. His performances were a tightrope walk between ecstatic control and chaotic collapse. The music was a relentless fusion of hard-driving southern rock, greasy blues, and pure, uncut honky-tonk, all held together by the singular, terrifying power of his voice. One moment he would be unleashing a guttural roar, the next a soaring, delicate falsetto that could silence a rowdy room. For the audience, it was intoxicating. They saw in him their own struggles, their own desperate need for release, and they roared his lyrics back at him in a shared exorcism of pain and pleasure. He followed up his breakthrough success with a string of albums that solidified his sound and his reputation. Records like Steppin' Out, 1976, and Your Place or Mine, 1977, delivered the hits his fans and his label craved: Flat, Natural, Born, Good Time in Man, In Some Room Above the Street, Your Place or Mine. The songs were masterful examples of the honky-tonk genre, filled with clever wordplay and tales of romantic misadventures. Yet, even within these crowd-pleasing anthems, a deeper, more complex artistry was evident. Gary possessed a songwriter's gift for detail and a singer's genius for emotional nuance. He could take a simple cheating song and transform it into a profound meditation on loneliness and moral compromise. Beneath the wild man public persona, however, was a man of surprising depth and sensitivity. The king of the honky tonks was a voracious reader, a quiet and thoughtful man who was far more comfortable at home with his wife Mary Lou than he was navigating the shark-infested waters of the music industry. Mary Lou remained his anchor, the fixed point in his chaotic orbit. Their love story was the silent, steady heartbeat beneath the loud, frantic rhythm of his music. He was the quintessential Nashville paradox, a man who sang almost exclusively about infidelity and romantic turmoil, yet was, by all accounts, a profoundly devoted husband. This quiet domesticity was his sanctuary, the place he could retreat to when the pressures of his public life became too much to bear. And the pressures were immense. The very authenticity that had made him a star now threatened to become a gilded cage. He was expected to be the good timing man 24 hours a day, an expectation fueled by the industry's relentless cycle of touring and promotion and by his own escalating dependence on alcohol and drugs. The lifestyle he sang about was no longer just an act. It had become his reality. Yet artistically, he was growing restless. He felt trapped by the Honky Tonk label, a king who was beginning to find the confines of his own kingdom suffocating. He harbored ambitions that stretched far beyond the jukebox, and he was about to make the boldest and most commercially perilous move of his career. By the end of the 1970s, Gary Stewart was at a creative crossroads. He had mastered a formula, but his restless muse demanded more. He decided to create a record that would shatter the expectations of his fans and his label, a project that would showcase the full breadth of his musical influences. The result was the 1980 album Cactus and a Rose. It was not just a departure. It was a declaration of artistic independence. He shed the king of the Honky Tonks persona like a snakeskin, revealing a more introspective, poetic, and musically adventurous artist underneath. To realize his vision, he assembled a dream team of Southern rock and blues royalty. He collaborated with guitar virtuoso Dickey Betts of the Allman Brothers Band, enlisted the rhythm section of Mick Fleetwood and John McVie from Fleetwood Mac, and brought in legendary singer-songwriter Townes Van Zandt. The recording sessions were a vibrant cross-genre experiment. The album that emerged was a stunning, sprawling tapestry of sound. It blended soulful ballads, hard-edged rock, and haunting blues-inflected country. Lyrically, it was a quantum leap forward, moving away from simple barroom narratives to more complex, metaphorical explorations of love and loss. Songs like Okeechobee and the title track Cactus and a Rose were works of profound poetic beauty. Songs like Okeechobee and the title track Cactus and a Rose were works of profound poetic beauty. For him, it was a personal masterpiece, a definitive statement that proved he was not just a great country singer, but a visionary American artist with a soul that stretched far beyond the confines of the honky tonk. Critically, the album was a triumph. Reviewers hailed it as a work of genius, a bold and brilliant fusion of styles that transcended genre. But commercially, it was a catastrophe. RCA Records, his label, was utterly bewildered. They had been expecting another album of surefire honky tonk hits, and instead they got a complex, challenging piece of art. They had no idea how to market it. Country radio wouldn't touch it. It was too rock. Rock radio wouldn't play it. He was a country artist. The album died a quiet death, a commercial failure that fell through the cracks of a rigidly segregated music industry. For Gary, the rejection of his most personal and ambitious work was a crushing blow. It confirmed his deepest fears that the industry, and perhaps even his audience, didn't want the real Gary Stewart. They wanted the caricature. The failure of Cactus and a Rose marked a pivotal turning point. The rejection of his most personal and ambitious work was a crushing blow. It confirmed his deepest fears that the industry, and perhaps even his audience, didn't want the real Gary Stewart. They wanted the caricature. The failure of Cactus and a Rose marked a pivotal turning point. It was the beginning of a long, slow fade from the mainstream. The 1980s brought a seismic shift in the country music landscape. The gritty outlaw sound was supplanted by the slick, pop-oriented urban cowboy movement. Country music became smoother, safer, and more polished than ever. Gary Stewart's raw, ragged sound was suddenly an artifact from a bygone era. His contract with RCA was not renewed, and he found himself without a major label for the first time in years. What followed were the wilderness decades. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Gary continued to tour and record for smaller independent labels, producing a body of work that was consistently excellent and almost completely ignored by the mainstream. He never chased trends or compromised his sound. He remained defiantly, stubbornly himself, playing his brand of intensely sad, party-down music for a shrinking but fiercely devoted cult following. His name became a kind of secret password among true country music connoisseurs, a symbol of uncompromising artistry and authenticity. He was no longer the king of the honky tonks, but rather the king of a much smaller, more exclusive kingdom, a kingdom of one. During this time, his long-simmering battles with addiction intensified. Without the structure and demands of stardom, his demons gained a stronger foothold. His live performances, once legendary for their brilliance, became erratic. Sometimes the old fire would blaze, and he would deliver a show that reminded everyone of his genius. Other times, he would be a shadow of his former self, his performance marred by intoxication. He was trapped in a tragic loop, a man whose art was born from his pain, and whose pain was now consuming his art. Through it all, Mary Lou remained his constant. Their bond, forged in their teenage years, was the one thing in his tumultuous life that never wavered. She was his nurse, his caretaker, his biggest fan, and his only true confidant. She was the quiet grace that allowed his chaotic genius to exist. For 43 years, through stardom and obscurity, through soaring highs and crushing lows, she was there. In the autumn of 2003, the unthinkable happened. Mary Lou fell ill with pneumonia, and in November she passed away. For Gary, a man whose entire emotional architecture was built upon the foundation of this one relationship, the loss was not just heartbreaking, it was unsurvivable. The anchor that had held him steady through a lifetime of storms was suddenly gone, and he was cast adrift in a sea of grief from which he could find no shore. His friends and family watched in despair as he was consumed by a profound depression. The man whose voice had been a conduit for so much emotion was now rendered silent by it. He stopped eating. He barricaded himself in his Florida home, refusing to answer the phone or see visitors. The king was in exile, alone in his grief-stricken kingdom. His daughter Shannon would later give the most succinct and heartbreaking diagnosis of her father's condition. "My dad had a broken heart, and he couldn't get over it." On the night of December 16th, 2003, just under a month after Mary Lou's death, Gary was scheduled to play a gig. When he failed to appear, his worried bandmates tried to reach him. The calls went unanswered. His son-in-law, fearing the worst, drove to the house and found a note on the door. The police were called. When they entered the home, they found that the long, tragic, beautiful song of Gary Stewart had come to an end. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 59 years old. The news of his death sent a quiet shockwave through the music world. It was a tragic, almost preordained final chapter to a life lived without a safety net. His legacy is not one of stadium tours or platinum plaques. It is something more potent and enduring. It lives in the searing honesty of his music, in that one-of-a-kind voice that could tremble with the weight of the world. He was a vital link between the raw-boned country of his heroes and the southern rock he so admired, creating a hybrid sound that would influence generations of alternative country and Americana artists who valued authenticity over polish. To listen to Gary Stewart is to be confronted with a beautiful, terrible truth, that our greatest joys are often tangled up with our deepest sorrows, and that the brightest flames often burn out the fastest. He was a king who ruled over the lonely and the lost, a genius who was too fragile for the world he so brilliantly chronicled. He was the ghost in the jukebox, and his haunting, heartbreaking wail will echo for as long as there are people who seek solace in a sad country song on a Saturday night.